So the next major part of American expansion in the 19th century is the Mexican American War. And I don't think I actually even put the title Mexican American War on here, but that's what I'm talking about. So you have James Polk as president. He comes after Zachary Tyler, who's ushered in Texas. And Polk is a big Manifest Destiny guy. He wants California. Of course, a lot of Americans wanted California at the time. I mean, California's beautiful. There's great agriculture, all this kind of stuff. And then in California, they have kind of a labor supply in the sense that they have some native populations that they can rely on to help develop the land. And so, U.S. really wants California. Polk offers to buy California from Mexico. Mexico says no. So Polk decides this is right after Texas has been brought into the United States, and there's this debate over where the border is. Right, of course. Remember, Mexico never actually recognized Texas independence, so the question of is this even really legal? There's all kinds of complicated questions. So where is the southern boundary of the United States? That's the prevailing question. Mexico is they've got troops stationed along the Nueces River, which, if you think about your Texas geography, so the Rio Grande's the southern part, and then just above that is the Nueces River. And it doesn't go all the way across Texas, but it kind of comes from the Gulf of Mexico, kind of past Houston, kind of towards central Texas a little bit. And so Mexico had troops stationed right around that Nueces River, and that they were trying to enforce that, hey, this is the boundary of Mexico. Except that Polk decides that he's going to, after Mexico has refused to sell him what he wants, he decides to station troops right there along the Nueces. And guess what? There's an incident, right? The gun goes off, somebody gets shot, the Mexicans attack the American soldiers, and then Polk runs around and says, oh my goodness, they attacked us. We have to do something. We cannot let this stand. And so next thing you know, you've got the U.S. declaring war on Mexico. Now, this war is highly controversial, right? We tend to think of war protest only in the context of Vietnam, but this was the Vietnam of the 19th century, right? You had huge numbers of Americans that did not approve of this. A lot of them are have a religious background. Part of these religious reform movements that come up as a response to the market economy, but they'll see that the war is illegal and immoral, and they'll protest and protest and protest. Henry David Thoreau will actually go to jail for refusing to pay his taxes because he doesn't want his tax dollars to go for it. You have Congress, even within Congress, people like Abraham Lincoln aren't crazy about the war. Now, they will sign bills, author bills to help fund the war effort because they want to take care of the soldiers. So you have a lot of the same kind of debate about the Mexican-American War that we had about Vietnam, that we have now about Iraq and Afghanistan, where, is this a legitimate use of American force? And yet, you want to critique the policy of going to war without ignoring the soldiers that need your help, that need the funds, that need the resources, right? So basically we go in and I'm glossing over all kinds of nuances to the story. There's several instances of violence by American troops against Mexican towns where they rape women, they tear things up, but it's not all that American soldiers are bad, right? That's not all of them, but that does happen a few times. The U.S. really just kind of sweeps in. There's no question that this is a significant win for the U.S. forces, and this essentially forces Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now that matters because it gives the United States California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, settles the boundary of Texas, all in exchange for $15 million. Okay, so basically the U.S. then becomes coast to coast after the Mexican-American War. Um, and this is, going to make slavery kind of a super hot button issue, right? And so much so that you start to have within Congress things like the Wilmot Proviso that tried to stop the spread of slavery, that kind of freaks out Southerners. And they go, "Oh my gosh, no, these crazy abolitionists." Like kind of heightens the debate that slaves were property; they should be able to take them wherever they want. So the foreign policy perspective really has a lot to do with triggering this war with Mexico, and then the subsequent land that we get from it. Now, as far as women are concerned, you're going to have women that involved in the Transcendentalist movement, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. The Transcendentalist movement is those women are going to be much more vocal about kind of resisting the war effort. A lot of the Transcendentalists opposed war. Excuse me. Oh gosh, again, it's 6:00 in the morning. So yeah, the Transcendentalists are very much, and they're fairly equitable between men and women. Many of these kind of reform groups, these religious groups, do have, and I use the term equality loosely, at least kind of recognize the role of women, the importance of women, and women as kind of intellectual, spiritual beings. And so women do protest the war. They aren't happy about it. A lot of women do things like roll bandages, right? You have a few women. We don't really have widespread nursing just yet. It's kind of developing. Like you've got your earliest kind of, Florence Nightingale in England. This is about the time of the Crimean War with Great Britain. And so she's kind of ushering in this notion of women as nurses. So you don't really have that taking hold until you really get to the Civil War. That's where you see that kind of transition as far as women and roles. But you do have women involved in kind of those kind of like rolling bandages and preparing care packages and that kind of thing. The biggest impact of the Mexican-American War is that it basically changes the laws in places like California from the Mexican system to the American system. And as I've mentioned before, the key difference there is the property rights that Mexico gave women that they lose because of the United States taking over. And then you've got Mexican American women who lose everything because the system is set up to advantage Americans. So suddenly they would jack up taxes on property and force Mexican families to have to sell. And these are some huge swaths of property, right? So some of them owned these large homes, these large farms, and you would have the American government, the local California government, finding ways to kind of basically steal that land from people. So women were a part of that problem as well. But for the most part, the Mexican-American War period is largely about the guys, right? Because they're going to war. Now, I will say that you have, as we've kind of solidified this coast-to-coast manifest destiny, you've got, the development of the Compromise of 1850. So how are we going to bring California into the country? How are we going to make all of this work? And essentially what ends up happening with the Compromise of 1850 is that you have this political arrangement by which New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada are allowed this concept called popular sovereignty, this idea that those territories could decide for themselves if they wanted to be slave or free. Now, what I would suggest to you is those territories are not really good for growing cotton. Prior to the existence of air conditioning, you're not going to have a ton of settlement there. The Mormons are in Utah, and they don't. Oh, my lights went off. Sorry, they're on a timer. So you have this whole idea of Mormons that don't believe in that slavery, largely because they have these ideas about people of color that they've since changed those rules, but those beliefs. But in the 19th century, they certainly had some concepts about or African Americans that would now be considered kind of racially kind of tilted. So like those states are not going to have an interest in having slavery. And so it's kind of a non-issue, right? There's not a ton of people going there. The big deal is bringing California in as a free state and bringing Texas in as a slave state. Texas gives up some land to kind of settle some of these boundaries in exchange for the United States government paying off their debt from being when they were an independent country and when they were at war with Mexico. They end slave trading in Washington, D.C., and most notably, they create a very tough, very rigid Fugitive Slave Act that makes it so that it makes it a lot easier for slave owners to go claim slaves in other territories. So the Compromise of 1850 finally kind of balances these competing interests so that they can begin to develop the region, right? And so then you've got these three regions, right? The North, the South, and the West that are interconnected by what is a national market and a global economy, which is raw materials, cotton, grains, that kind of production. Early factory systems creating textiles and other products. And then you've got the West, which is really kind of this place of opportunity of, let's move out West, let's take advantage of this chance in extracting resources. They're extracting gold, for instance, the 49ers, that kind of thing. And so this kind of relationship, you see kind of these competing regions kind of creating an issue. So I kind of wanted to remind you exactly kind of what we're talking about with kind of different types of regions and how these work together. So the last one I'll give you is the political dysfunction of this period. So the Compromise of 1850, while it does kind of hold the country together for 10 more years, but it creates a lot of issues, right? A lot of blacks moved to Canada out of fear of being kind of kidnapped because the fugitive slave law makes it so easy. Basically, slave owners could send a representative who would go say, yeah, I think that guy's my slave, and pay a fine and take them home, right? So the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act really depended on whether you had state or city police up north that would allow for these kind of representatives of the slave owners to come in. Some cities did not, but some cities absolutely did, where you had the police force essentially acting as slave catchers. So this long, complicated history of African Americans with the police goes back to this period. And so a lot of blacks move to Canada. The Underground Railroad gets even more active than it ever was before, kind of as an act of resistance. And it makes it so that ordinary white people in the North, right, that perhaps didn't have slaves, didn't really think about slaves, didn't really like the concept of slavery, suddenly are forced to confront slavery, because if they are seen as having allowed a runaway slave to be, if they knew about somebody that was a runaway slave, they were supposed to report it or they faced a fine. So the Compromise of 1850 really kind of starts to force people into camps, either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so it's into this environment that you have a lot of kind of stalled out dysfunction. Now, the issue is, though, that to get all these resources from the West into the East, you need to have a railroad, right? You have to finish products from the East to the West. So there's this big push to build some kind of rail system. And Stephen Douglas comes up with this idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is basically popular sovereignty. So that idea of popular sovereignty that existed for New Mexico and Arizona, where there weren't a lot of people, is now going to be applied to Kansas. And Kansas is much more attractive to people. It's much closer. And this is going to result in what's known as Bleeding Kansas, right? This is essentially you have lots of Southern men bleeding over into Kansas, kind of trying to set up kind of quick communities so they can cast a vote for a constitution that is pro-slavery. And then you've got lots of abolitionists sending families into Kansas to set up communities that are anti-slavery. And so you've got this profound tension in Kansas over pro and anti-slavery. That results in violence by border ruffians, violence by John Brown, who kills, like 6 people that were pro-slavery. And so you've got lots of kind of issues. You end up with two constitutions coming from Kansas. Congress eventually accepts the Topeka Constitution, which is the one that does not allow slavery. So Kansas ends up being a free state. But it was a huge controversy, right, over what was happening with Kansas. And Charles Sumner was a senator, and he makes kind of a snarky comment about another senator from South Carolina, and there's a representative from South Carolina who's related, and he basically beats the crap out of Charles Sumner over the slavery issue, right? So lots of kind of really dramatic issues that kind of take place. There's a really funny drunk history episode that talks about the beating of Charles Sumner, and kind of gives you an idea. You kind of have the violence of slavery. This question about, are we going to be slave or are we going to be free, is taking place like at ground zero with Kansas, and that's spilling over onto the Senate floor and all that kind of stuff. And so you have lots of kind of dysfunction coming out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lots of the anti-immigrant sentiment comes up, and in the Northeast with the factory system. So the factory system had been around, you're talking about, 20 to 30 years. And the women workers had been replaced / added to by immigrant workers. And so you have a lot of white guys that get really resentful about job competition. So your wave of kind of nativism of anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, it was all very anti-Irish. So very kind of pushing back against those groups. So the Know Nothing Party kind of gets developed. They never really win. I think they win some seats in the Massachusetts legislature, but they kind of fade away. But they do kind of have an influence in that you've got people within a party called the Whig Party, right, which was formed during Andrew Jackson's period, right? So the Federalists go away. They get replaced by the Whigs. The Whigs kind of have a little kind of moment in the sun. But by the time you get to 1850, they're kind of falling away. They're losing traction. They don't have a good base anymore, and so their base kind of starts getting pulled in a bunch of different directions. And one of them is the Know Nothing Party, which is purely anti-immigrant. The other one is the Free Soil Party, which is an anti-slavery party. Now, don't confuse that with being kind of woke or equal-minded. They just believed that the West should only be for white guys, right? That plantation owners were detrimental to the economic well-being of ordinary Americans, right? So the Free Soil Party, which has this economic focus, the Know Nothing Party, which is anti-immigrant. And then out of this is going to come the Republican Party that will produce Abraham Lincoln, right? So the Republican Party, and this is the foundation of the modern Republican Party, although again, they kind of switch they go through transition periods where they kind of change. So yes, it is the forerunner of our modern Republican Party. There's a lot of components that I don't think we would recognize as being part of the Republican Party. Things like strong federal government interference. But nevertheless, this leads to kind of the end of the Whigs and the election of 1860. But the election of 1860 doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's into this that, after the violence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have a thing called the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where essentially the Supreme Court, led by this horribly racist guy named Judge Taney, however you say his name, he basically says that people of color are just property, that they've never been citizens, that it's okay to take them wherever you want, and essentially affirms that the entire country is open for slavery, right? And it's because of that decision that John Brown, who's left Kansas by this point after having killed 6 people, and decides that he's going to kind of raise a group of followers. He's going to go into Virginia, seize the federal armory, and then wait for slaves in the area to rise up and kind of help him lead a revolution. So that this is what Harper's Ferry is. Harper's Ferry freaks the South out. And so these events, right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, Harper's Ferry, and the creation of the Republican Party all lay the foundation blocks towards the Civil War. And again, all of this is tied into political dysfunction and land expansion and all that kind of stuff. Now, again, what is it for women? Well, they can't vote, so they're not really responsible for the political dysfunction. Again, in a lot of ways, they're responding to circumstances in the worlds in which they live. For Southern women, I don't think life has changed particularly. For women in the North, it hasn't changed particularly, especially for middle class women. They still have that cult of domesticity. Factory worker women have actually seen a decline in their power and their standards. And women in the West face really kind of challenging conditions. Now, women in the West really are going to have a little more power in the sense that gender disparity means that they have a little more negotiating strength. Women in the North have none, and women in the South are bound by kind of this patriarchal society as it's been created in the Southern United States. Now, so all of this dysfunction, all this political dysfunction, all these problems, all this expansion, it's into this environment that you have a series of reform movements that kind of pop up, and you have women starting to ask some really hard questions. So while I say that women didn't actually have a role in this particular period, they're making their own role. Right? They're saying, you know what, this system's broken. This isn't working. We're going to come over here. We're going to do our own thing. And so they become very much involved in religious movements, very much involved in reforming society, and most importantly, leading kind of the first push for women to get the right to vote. Really largely seen as a way to kind of respond to what they perceive as the political dysfunction. So we'll be talking about the reform movements and going into that in more detail on September 28th. And then, like I said, and we'll kind of touch onto that, not only the reform movement stuff, but also the issue of the Civil War and how women kind of acted in the Civil War. I won't go into a ton of detail on that. You can read the Yop chapter on the Civil War to kind of get an idea about that. Plus, if you have American Heroes channel or History Channel, they show all kinds of stuff. Or Netflix, there's all kinds of documentaries about the Civil War. So we'll kind of look at that on the 28th. And then, like I said, on the 5th, we'll kind of save that for kind of an overflow for kind of looking at where things were going, especially in light of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and kind of wrap up kind of the course. I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to record a video that kind of gives an overview, but this gets you kind of through the lecture portion and kind of gives you a foundation about how women were contributing to this Western expansion. And then, like I said, next, when we meet on the 28th, we'll go into the reform movements, which is really where the meat of kind of this gender version of history kind of comes from.